This is your guide to effective research presentations. The first step to developing an effective presentation is to make sure that you are well organized so that you can create a well-organized presentation. You want to make sure that your presentation has a clear introduction, main point, and conclusion. Therefore, you should start with your introduction and frame the importance of your topic. Make sure the audience understands why they should care about the topic on which you are presenting. You also want to make sure that you have an appropriate scope. You don't want a topic that's too broad, that is hard to encompass all the research on that topic, or too narrow that you can only find one or two high-quality studies. Within the body of your presentation, you want to make sure that you are effectively and clearly articulating your key messages. You need to support these messages with data and credible rationale so that your audience not only receives your messages, but believes in them too. An effective presentation reiterates key messages at the end of the presentation so that you're leaving your audience with a memory bite. They have a clear picture of what they learned from their presentation and how they can use this in their future research and practice. To achieve this goal, your presentation should be focused, well thought out, and critical. You should be reading relevant research and synthesizing that research in a way that creates a cohesive set of messages that you can then convey to your audience. In addition to the information that you put together for your presentation, you should also think about how you will effectively deliver your presentation in whatever context you are to deliver it. Regardless of whether you are presenting in person or online, you want to make sure that you rehearse so that you can speak clearly, at an even pace, and confidently about your topic. Make sure that you are projecting so that your audience can hear you and understand what you are saying. You've spent the time to research your topic and become an expert in it. Use your body language to convey this expertise and authority as well. Stand up straight, have good posture, and make sure that you are showing that you are confident, you are prepared, and you are ready to educate your audience on this topic about which you know so much. Also make sure that you look the part. Dress professionally so that you give the situation the professional weight that it deserves. Typically, you're given a time limit for your presentation, and it's really important to stick to this time limit out of respect to the organizers, your fellow presenters, and your audience. If you go over your time, this means that you are taking up time that others could be using for their presentation or that your audience needs for their other obligations. Most audiences know how long your presentation should last, so when your presentation goes over, they start to get distracted, wondering when you're going to wrap up, and maybe needing a break. This means that the last parts of your presentation can be very ineffective because your audience is distracted and not able to fully listen to what you're saying and glean the messages that you're trying to convey. We typically rely on PowerPoint or other presentation software platforms to create slides that assist us in our presentation. These slides should be viewed as a presentation tool and not as a script. For example, this slide, which is introducing the audience to the topic, is not effective. Let's break down the different components of this slide that are not working very well, so we can then think about how to revise the slide in a way that makes for a more effective presentation. The slide title is not very descriptive. It does little to support the overall point you're trying to make, other than to tell your audience, this is the introduction. Typically, your audience has a sense of where you are in the presentation, so this is really just a waste of space. There is so much text on this slide. When this happens, your audience must choose whether to listen to you or to read your slide. Also notice that the bullets on the slide are all over the place. This slide is trying to do too much and conveying too many disparate points. Each slide should have one main point that it's trying to convey, and the next slide can then convey the next point. Here's a revised introduction to the ketogenic diet. As you can see, this slide is much cleaner and clearer and conveys one very clear main point. In particular, notice that this slide uses what's called an assertion evidence structure, which is a great way to convey main points and the justification for those points. This structure is much like the way you organize your writing, where for each paragraph you have a topic sentence, evidence to support that topic sentence, and then analysis and transition that leads you to the next paragraph. Similarly, these slides have an assertion for their title, so you have a main topic sentence that clearly tells your audience what they're supposed to learn from this slide. Your evidence comes down in the body of the slide in the form of visuals or some sort of data that support your main point. As you can see, this slide much more effectively introduces the audience to the ketogenic diet because it clearly states that it's a high-fat, moderate protein, low-carbohydrate diet, and then the pie charts very clearly contrast the USDA dietary reference intakes for these macronutrients with the recommended macronutrients for the ketogenic diet. The data and pictures on this slide are so much more interesting than all the wordy bullets that were on the previous slide. And because these are simple enough figures, they're very impactful too, because they clearly support the main message in the way that the audience can quickly grasp and understand on their own even before you talk them through this figure. Overall, this slide is clean and easy to read and is effective in complementing what you are saying rather than competing for your audience's attention. So I recommend that you lean heavily on images in the form of stock photos, icons, figures, or tables. All of these can very effectively convey your points in ways that are very interesting and engaging for your audience, and also don't mean that your audience is trying to read wordy slides while also trying to listen to you. However, you do want to be aware that when you are selecting images, it's not really best practice to just do a Google search and pull whatever you find on the internet, because many of those pictures are copyrighted, and so by pulling them and using them in your presentation, you're violating someone else's copyright. So you do want to be mindful about where you find your images. There are settings within Google Images that you can use to check the licensing for the images that you find, but you can also use resources where the images are made freely available for anyone who needs them. These include sites like Pixabay, Creative Commons, the Noun Project, and the Red Center Media Gallery. So let's think a little more deeply about effective slides, and in particular, how we can effectively use images, tables, and figures to present data to our audience. We'll go through some slides that are problematic, and then go through some revisions of these slides to give you some ideas of how to create your own slides that effectively complement your presentation. Here's our first problematic slide. This introductory slide has a very boring title and very wordy bullets. This title is ineffective and is essentially a waste of space. We could use the space much more wisely to make sure that we are emphasizing our main introductory point. The bullets contain too many words and try to cover too many topics. It would be much more effective to use a figure to convey the messages that are included within these slides. The choice of bullets is also distracting and the text is too small. It would be very hard for your audience to read this while they're trying to listen to you. Here's an alternative approach to this slide. Here we have a clear assertion at the top of the slide, stating that racial and ethnic disparities exist for the prevalence of obesity in the United States. We also have a figure that is colorful and interesting and very clearly shows us that by these different racial and ethnic groups, we see differences in trends for obesity and prevalence of obesity in recent assessments. When you present this slide, you would want to clearly communicate your main message, but you would also want to make sure to take the time to walk your audience through this figure. Don't just say racial and ethnic disparities exist and then move on to the next slide. You've essentially wasted your figure. You didn't take the time to honor it and give it the full attention it deserves, and that means that your audience may have missed the opportunity to read it and interpret it in the way that you wanted them to. Here's another problematic slide. Here we have a results slide with a very big table with very tiny text. Again, we have an ineffective title that's essentially a waste of space. This table really adds no value to our message because it's so hard to read that it really doesn't effectively illustrate the main findings or the key points that we want to mention. I have seen so many conference presenters who put a table up like this and say, I know this is hard to read, but just believe me when I tell you that X was associated with Y, and that's what's shown in this table. Why present data if you're not going to give your audience the time to understand it and digest it as a form of credible evidence to support your key message? Here's a somewhat better approach. If you absolutely feel that you need to present a big table like this, then make sure that you're maximizing the space available for this table and then using animations to focus your audience's attention. Perhaps even better would be to break this table up into smaller chunks so we can still convey the information in the table, but do so in a way that's a bit more purposeful and helps to manage our audience's attention so they don't get overwhelmed by our visual aids. By breaking this table up, we can then continue to use our annotations and animations to highlight their attention, but overall there's less distraction within this table. Here's the second half of this table. Still a lot of numbers and a lot of words, but a bit easier to read, and we can continue to annotate and animate to focus attention. Here's a slide that presents some data, but in a way that's a little bit cluttered and unclear. This was a study of breastfeeding mothers looking at whether aspects of nipple anatomy, in particular how wide and long nipples were, predicted latch problems, or problems related to the baby being unable to latch onto the breast during breastfeeding. Although we have a more effective title that's trying to convey the main findings in this section, these bullets are wordy, and so they're a little bit hard to read on top of all the other things going on in this slide. In addition, the way that the findings are being conveyed is not very effective because they don't specify the direction of association. How exactly was nipple width associated with latch problems? We don't really know because the term being used here is association rather than adding terms like positive or negative or other terms that would give us a better sense of the direction and magnitude of the association seen. In addition, if the presenter were to just emphasize the main point, go through the bullets, and then move on to the next slide, then really having this figure on here is a waste of space and just clutters the slide. So it's important that if this figure is going to be on the slide, that you take the time to directly address every image on the slide and address what this figure means and how it contributes to your main point. Here's a somewhat better version of this slide. Here we have a clear title that tells us that we are looking at predictors of latch problems, and on this slide we're looking at the significant interaction between nipple width and length. We have text on this slide, but it's clearly highlighting the finding that we want the audience to know about. Instead of reporting every aspect of the findings that could be gleaned from this figure, we are using images, icons, and big text to very clearly call out that at higher nipple lengths, greater nipple widths predicted greater probability of latch problems. So we more clearly see that when mothers had longer and wider nipples, their babies had a harder time latching onto their breasts. This figure is somewhat complicated, but we can also use annotations here to call out pertinent aspects of this figure. We again would want to very clearly explain what the x-axis represents, nipple width, what the y-axis represents, the probability of latch problems, and what the figure legend communicates, which is grouping mothers into those with higher versus lower nipple lengths. We can then use animations to call out the most significant association here. That we saw that for mothers with higher nipple lengths, their nipple width mattered in that it was positively associated with greater probability of latch problems. When mothers had shorter nipples, there was no association with how wide their nipples were and latch problems. Here's another slide that presents a figure that's engaging but incomplete. So although the title very clearly states what we should glean from this figure, we're missing important components that allow us to understand what this figure conveys. In particular, there's no labels on the X or Y axis, so we don't know what they represent. There's also no figure legend, so we'd have no idea what the different colored lines mean in this figure. Although you may walk through this figure in a way that helps your audience interpret it, It's also important to remember that your audience may zone in or out to your talk at different points. They may become distracted by a notification on their phone or someone else in the audience. Therefore, you don't want them to tune back into your talk and then be lost because they don't have all the information they need on your slide to catch up to where you are. So make sure that you're not fully relying on what you say to convey what the figure means, but that you're putting in the information the audience would expect to be able to understand this figure as they look at it. So by adding in X and Y axis labels, as well as a legend, we can more clearly understand what this figure means and what these data convey. We see that the X-axis represents the duration of follow-up after a weight loss program, and the Y-axis tells us the amount of weight lost. We see that the different colored lines represent the different treatment groups who tried exercise alone versus diet and exercise versus diet alone versus meal replacement plans versus very low energy diets versus Orlistat, which is a weight loss drug, versus just advice alone. Even better would be to create a figure legend in the same direction as the lines. As you can see, the advice alone line is the black line with a diamond. That's on the bottom of the legend, but on the top of the distribution of lines in the figure. The audience has to do a little bit of mental gymnastics to align the figure legend with the lines within the figure, and it would be better to flip the legend so that it more easily aligns with what's in the figure. Whatever you can do to make it so that your audience doesn't have to think that hard to interpret what's going on, the more your audience will be able to stick with you, focus on what you're saying, and less on what they're confused about or need to think hard about in the figure. So in this way, don't be afraid to add elements for clarity or to revise elements within PowerPoint or whatever presentation software you're using to make sure that the figures and tables you present are really working along with your message rather than counteracting your message because they're ineffective visual aids or are distracting to your audience. Here's another slide of data that I just made up to further illustrate how to make sure that figures are good visual aids and are accurately conveying our data. Again, we have a figure that's somewhat problematic because there's no X and Y axis labels and because it's zoomed in, which artificially magnifies differences. We can guess that these data represent a percentage of time children spend outside based on what's in the title of this slide. So the relevant range of responses would be 0 to 100 because this is a percentage. But by magnifying from 30 to 80, that means we're also artificially magnifying differences, which is not a very accurate portrayal of our data. Therefore, whenever possible, we want to make sure that our y-axis represents the plausible range of values or the possible range of values to make sure that we're not artificially altering our data in a way that is insincere or incorrectly emphasizes differences that don't actually exist. So here we can see with the X and Y axis labels, the accurate range for the Y-axis values, and the clear legend. This is a much more effective visual that we could then walk our audience through to make sure that they understand trends over time as well as differences between 2 to 5-year-olds and 6 to 10-year-olds in the percentage of time that they spent outside. I hope these exercises were helpful to you to better understand how you can prepare your research presentation and effectively present data in a way that contributes to your overall messages and supports your main ideas. To summarize, proper preparation is key. Make sure that you're giving yourself the time to prepare and practice your presentation to ensure that it is effective. Remember that slides are tools that should help you in your presentation, not serve as a script or a decoration for your presentation. I recommend that you attempt the assertion evidence structure as an effective way to communicate your key points and to use data to support these points. When using your visuals, think through how you can use them wisely. Whenever you can use a picture, do it. An image, a figure, or a table is worth 1,000 words, and it's much more interesting and engaging for your audience. If you do include some sort of picture on your slide, make sure you take the time to address it. Make sure you're taking the time to walk through it so your audience fully understands what it means and why you're showing it to them. If you aren't going to address what's on your slide, then leave it off. Don't be afraid to use things like simple tables or animations to highlight your key points. These can effectively manage your audience's focus so they're not getting distracted by other aspects on your slide when you're trying to focus them in on a key point. Make sure you're taking the time to walk your audience through figures to ensure that they understand the main messages. Also, don't be afraid to augment tables or figures to improve their effectiveness, or to remake tables or figures to make sure that they are effective visuals on your slides. I hope these tips help you to prepare an effective research presentation.